Like mentioned on Monday, this week is a theme week, where we have something big coming up in the motorsport calendar, whether that's an event or an anniversary or just a general thing, and I whet your appetite for that particular thing with videos on that particular thing. With the Canadian Grand Prix this weekend and also Le Mans, that's what we're looking at this week. This year's Le Mans will be quite a poignant one for reasons we'll discuss when we get there, because the world as we know it as racing fans might be slightly different if different authorities around the world went in a slightly different direction. But with the Canadian Grand Prix, last time out we looked at the 2007 edition of that race, although I could have easily picked at least 2 other races from the Canadian Grand Prix archives to look at, because the race has produced some pretty famous, and in the case of 2011, wet races. That was an afternoon well spent, wasn't it? But to say it's Jenson Button's best drive? The guy was doing everything in his power to lose that race. Hungary 2006 was probably better, but that's some early hot takes debate engagement. At least, it'll be taken that way. The other Canadian Grand Prix I could have picked was the 2008 edition, where Lewis Hamilton drove into the back of Kimi Raikkonen in the pit lane like an idiot, and Robert Kubica had this redemption arc, winning the race where he'd had that monster shunt the year before. But today, I want to do an anniversary edition. 30 years ago today was the 1995 Canadian Grand Prix. I refuse to believe 1995 was 30 years ago. In the June of 1995, I was 3 months away from starting primary school. 30 years ago was the 1970s, not the 1990s. I need that watch from Bernard's Watch so I could, stop time. But the 90s was not just an era of a very young me, it was also the era of Britpop, the Spice Girls, Tamagotchis, and the Pokemon phenomenon was only, 8 or 9 months away by this point? Pokemon Red and Blue, released in February 1996, and the first Resident Evil game was also released in 1996. Send help. 1995 was the year that the following albums were released: What's the Story Morning Glory by Oasis, The Bends by Radiohead, Different Class by Pulp, The Great Escape by Blur, Green Day's Insomniac, the self-titled album by The Charlatans, the nightmare fuel that is Aphex Twin's I Care Because You Do, and Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette. That's it. I'm out of here. If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe. I've been Aidan Millward, and so on. But more importantly, the F1 cars of this time were among some of the most recognisable. I've never been one for, ooh, that was nice looking, or I really like that livery. But after going back and looking at some of the pictures of the time, I look at the likes of the Benetton and Williams and go, yeah, that's a cool shape. There's just a little something about the raised nose era of F1 cars. The boxier side pods, the noses, the simplicity of the front wings, and the rear wings as well, and how they were quite aesthetically pleasing, even if the designers would shape them like Piers Morgan if it meant an extra half a tenth. From a gaming perspective, these cars are pretty much perfect. They've got enough downforce to stick you to the ground, but they've got enough power relative to their mechanical and aerodynamic grip that they'll spin you off the road if you try to overdo it. 1995 was supposed to be the continuation of what had happened the previous year. Michael Schumacher was the reigning champion, having taken the title at Adelaide in controversial circumstances. And yes, I know a video on that does need doing at some point. I'll get round to it eventually. Williams had won the Constructors, and one of the most common comments I get when mentioning that Renault-powered cars won in 92, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 is that Ford won in 1994. But they didn't. Schumacher won the title, that much is true, but Williams won the Constructors, not Benetton. This time, the hope was that the season would be a straight fight, with the horrors and controversy of the previous year left in the previous year. And it started out as people would have hoped. The Michael won the first round in Brazil, but Damon struck back, winning the next 2 rounds in Argentina and Italy, with the race in Italy being billed as the San Marino Grand Prix, as it quite rightly should. But anything Damon could do, Schumacher could do as well, because the Michael won at Spain and in Monaco. Now, as a fun fact here, in the opening 5 rounds of the 1995 season, not once had the race been won from pole position. It wouldn't be until the Hungarian Grand Prix, round 10 of the season, where it would actually happen. Going into the Canadian Grand Prix of 1995, Schumacher led the standings by 5 points. This being when the point structure was 10, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1, from 1st down to 6th. With reliability being a thing in those days, even for the top teams, that points tally could swing incredibly easily. Damon was second on 29 points, Berger had 17, Alesi 14, and Schumacher's teammate Johnny Herbert had 12. In the constructors, it was closer still. Benetton, Williams and Ferrari separated by just 5 points. Once again, if any of the big teams ran into issues in Canada, there could be some swapping around here too. Benetton on 36, Williams on 32, Ferrari 31. Then a gap to McLaren in 4th and Sauber in 5th, and these teams were yet to enter the double digits in terms of points hauls. For comparison, in the modern era, McLaren have got something like over 300 points at the time of writing. Yes, more races a season and a new point structure, but still. But there were some talking points heading into the Grand Prix. The circuit had in 1995, as it had done in 1994, the temporary chicane installed on the straight between the hairpin and the Wall of Champions chicane. Although to call it a straight isn't exactly the right thing to call it. It was a bit wavier in those days, before being straightened out for 1996. And I mentioned these chicanes in a dedicated video on the changes that they made for 1994, and showed the chicane in action, as it were, using clips from Trevor Sport's 1994 series. I highly recommend you go and watch that. There's a link in the description, and tell Trevor I sent you. But for the race, overtaking into the chicane had been banned. The drivers, particularly Damon and Michael, who were high up in the GPDA at the time, were a bit confused. Is it banned every lap, or just the first lap? While the engines had been shrunk down to 3 litres this season, down from the 3.5 litre engines they had in 1994, the FIA was understandably still a little bit paranoid when it came to safety. The drivers also didn't like how bumpy the circuit was, which is probably why it was all straightened out for 1996. Straightened out and smoothed off. Adding to the challenge of the weekend is that in the 30-minute warm-up session, where the teams sorted their race setups out and got used to running on high fuel loads, it had been raining. So the circuit was damp, and most of the teams had been anticipating the race to be dry. Schumacher was on pole for only the 9th time in his career. Hill was in 2nd, 3.25 tenths off, while David Coulthard in the 2nd Williams was another 10th further back. Ish. Berger outqualified Alesi with the Frenchman 8 tenths off the pace, while Herbert was in 6th. The remaining part of the top 10 was the McLaren of Hakkinen, the 2 Jordans of Irvine and Barrichello, and the 2nd McLaren of Mark Blundell. Oh yeah, that happened, didn't it? Because of the whole Mansell thing. Should probably note that down for another video, shouldn't I? By the time the field lined up for the green light, which was still a green light in those days with the 5 red light system coming in for 1996 onwards, the track was still damp. There were patches of wet tarmac interspersed with patches of dry tarmac, but despite this, they could still use slicks and get away with it. Schumacher converted his pole position, covering off Hill and Coulthard into turn 1. Alesi, meanwhile, who had started 6th, was being aggressive, and managed to jump 2 spots over the course of the opening couple of laps, with him overtaking teammate Berger as well as Coulthard's Williams in 1 corner on lap 2. Now that sounds like he pulled off some mesmerising 3-wide overtaking to the chicane before the hairpin, but what had actually happened was Coulthard had spun off with brake issues just ahead, while Jean overtook Berger on the inside. Further back, Hakkinen and Herbert never made the end of the first lap because they crashed into each other. Alesi found his feet once the race had settled down. While the yellow flags for Hakkinen and Herbert were still flying on lap 4, Alesi was lapping about 7 tenths of a second faster than Schumacher, who had pulled out around 3.5 seconds to Hill in 2nd place. As he entered the 3rd chicane on lap 4, Alesi almost did the same thing Coulthard did, with the cameras showing some amazing car control as he pulled up into that chicane at almost 45 degrees. Alesi was more determined than ever to do well at a Grand Prix. Rumours had been circulating in the press in the downtime between Monaco and Canada that Alesi's position in the Ferrari team was under threat. The rumours of Schumacher leaving his safety net at Benetton and joining up with the lads at Maranello had been brewing. And not only that, Alesi was on quite an unenviable run. He'd been driving for Ferrari for 67 races, this being his 68th, and he'd yet to score a win for the team, a record that has since been broken by Felipe Massa. Although Massa had won races for Ferrari before that record was set. Alesi hadn't just set the record for races without a win for Ferrari, he was about 90 races into his career and hadn't won a race at all. His talent levels and lack of luck would suggest he might have had at least 3, maybe 4 by now. And I have done a retrospective on the guy and talked about his career, but as a recap, he could have had a Williams deal and a very good car, later getting an active car that would have suited him down to the ground. But his heart chose Ferrari instead, and Ferrari was entering its banter years. Engines exploding, bad luck, the works. And in 1995, Alesi had been second twice at Argentina and also at Imola, and then retired while running second at Spain and in Monaco. And Monaco was just wrong place, wrong time. Martin Brundle had had an accident in front of him, and because it was Monaco, there was nowhere for Jean to go, so he crashed into him. He wouldn't know it at the time, but in 1996, he might have won the race easily following Damon Hill's retirement. But his suspension went. Needless to say, Jean Alesi was the nearliest of F1's nearly men, constantly going, what do I have to do to win a Grand Prix? In 2025, the closest thing we have to a Jean Alesi is probably Charles Leclerc. Don't give me that. He is. It was looking like a demolition job for Schumacher. By lap 12, he was 8 seconds in the lead, with Hill being harassed by the two Scarlet Ferraris. The Williams had a bit of an issue in track conditions where it was in that grey area between wet and dry, otherwise known as damp, and the car could be a real handful, as Coulthard had already found out. The Williams was also not liking the bumps, and with the Williams pit wall being as Ferrari-like as it was in 1995, it was not going to be a fun afternoon. And as a side note to show you how spread out the field was back in the mid-1990s, it took Schumacher just 12 laps to start lapping the back markers. With about 24 or so laps gone, Alesi finally cleared the struggling Williams. Hill was now down to third while Berger was next in the queue to get by, and Berger got passed into the third chicane on the very next lap. Katayama, who had already been in for one stop-go penalty, was given another when he was busted for speeding in the pit lane, with Berger and Hill struggling to navigate lap traffic. The blue flag rules that we love to yell at our TVs and then think that every motorsport on the planet follows those same blue flag rules didn't exist at this point, although this would all change over the next few months. The 107% rule had been announced just a couple of weeks prior, when it was discovered that teams just had to set a lap to make the grid, no matter how slow they were. Yeah, this is definitely my favourite era of Formula 1. But in terms of a show, there wasn't a lot going on. Schumacher was leading comfortably, and compared to what was happening in the 2007 race, it was actually pretty dull. The two Ferraris had made it into second and third. That's probably the main takeaway here. Aside from the collision on lap 1 between Herbert and Hakkinen, everything else except Coulthard spinning off and Jean-Christophe Bouillon's Sauber spinning off was typical 90s reliability. Montermini in the Pacific lost the gearbox, so did Diniz in the 40. Frentzen lost the engine in his Sauber, Gachot's battery went flat, Katayama's engine went pop, and so did Blundell's Mercedes engine in the back of his McLaren. On lap 50, Hill's frustrating race came to an end when he lost the gearbox on the pit straight, ending the weekend for Williams. Was it the bumps? Could have been. Was it just typical 90s reliability? It could have been. But Damon was thrown a lifeline in terms of the championship. 7 laps later, on lap 57, Schumacher was in the pits because his car had slowed down, being stuck in third gear. As the Michael pitted, the pit crew were around his car trying to work out what was going on, and he was there for well over a minute as they replaced the steering wheel and resetted the computers. Eventually, Schumacher got going, but he was no longer in the lead, and he was now going to be in 7th and out of the points. Prior to his issue, he was leading by nearly 30 seconds. So, Alesi took the lead, being 23 seconds clear of Barrichello's Jordan. Berger, meanwhile, had encountered issues and was back in 6th, and would later retire after colliding with Martin Brundle later on in the race, which helpfully promoted Schumacher up into 5th. But while the Canadian Tifosi were going wild in the stands, Alesi had little to no clue as to what was going on. When he passed the pit wall the lap that Schumacher pitted, the pit board still said that he was in 2nd, so he carried on as normal. But on the next lap, he saw that he was now in 1st because of Michael having his car reset. When he saw the 1 instead of the 2, tears welled up in his eyes and he almost missed turn 1 as a result. That would have been an embarrassing thing to tell the media after the race. Why did you go off at turn 1? Oh, I was leading and I started crying. Alesi had actually been fastest in the wet warm-up that morning, but when the track dried, hopes of a win faded because the Benetton was much faster in the dry and in Schumacher's hands. There was little to no hope of any success that afternoon, and after so many occasions where the random number generators had conspired against him, it looked like for once in his Formula 1 career, Alesi might actually shift that feeling of being cursed, and finally win a race. But there were issues brewing. You know I said Berger had issues before he punted Brundle off the road? Yeah, the issue was the fuel readings being a lie. Berger was that far back because when he pitted he'd actually run out of fuel. The Ferrari fuel gauges were not accurate enough. The Ferraris were one stopping in this Grand Prix, and the lead driver, Alesi in this case, decided when to pit. Alesi had pitted a lap early and got in and out with no problem. Berger meanwhile pitted with what should have been enough fuel in the tank, but when he entered the pit lane, the car ran out of fuel and he stopped. He was topped up, the engine restarted and sent on his way. But he was now in 6th when he should, really, be in 2nd. After so many years of trying, Alesi finally got his first ever Formula 1 victory. When he came round on the in-lap after taking the checkered flag, his Ferrari conked out just after the hairpin, because, just like Berger, Alesi had run out of fuel. Thankfully, Schumacher was the next car on the scene, so Alesi got out of the Ferrari, hopped on top of the Benetton and hitched a lift back to the pits. At the same time, the Tifosi were cheering like he just won the championship. Alesi had taken this win on his 31st birthday, barely able to see in front of him because he was crying, and the cheering of the Canadian Tifosi could be heard over the engines, it was that loud. When Alesi crossed the line, the track was invaded, and because there were still other cars finishing their laps, the FIA took the official results from lap 68 instead of lap 69, counting everybody back 1 lap. Originally, Salo had been overtaken by Bedoya on lap 69 as they avoided the crowds, but because of the countback, Salo kept his 7th place. Although for Salo this was actually lap 68 because he was a lap down, but you know what I mean. Alesi won by just over 30 seconds from the two Jordans of Barrichello and Irvine, and this is actually the first time that Jordan had got both cars onto the podium. Panis took 4th for Ligier, with Schumacher finishing 5th, thanks in part to Berger taking out Brundle, and Schumacher had actually been slamming in fastest laps towards the end to make up the time. Morbidelli in the footwork took the final points paying position, with Salo, Bedoya and Inouye finishing 7th, 8th and 9th, and 9 cars saw the checkered flag, with Brundle classified 10th after being punted off. For the constructors, this race did what was considered unthinkable. Ferrari was now leading the constructors from Benetton because Benetton only scored 2 points in that race, and Williams scored none. At the same time, Alesi's win made Ferrari the most successful team in Formula 1 in terms of races won. They'd now overtaken McLaren, or re-overtaken McLaren as the case might be. But either way, it was a fairy tale win. Alesi, as mentioned, had won on his 31st birthday after around 90 races or so of trying, in Ferrari's most trying period in Formula 1. Not only that, he was a French driver in the cultural and financial centre of French Canada at the Canadian Grand Prix in a Ferrari adorned with the number 27, the same number that Canada's most loved racing driver had when he drove for Ferrari at the circuit named in honour of that Canadian. That French Canadian. The luck that had shafted Alesi for so long in his career had all come at once, and everything lined up in a significant way for this one occasion. It would be the only win of Alesi's career. He came close again at Monaco the following year while driving for Benetton, but it was not to be. But he doesn't care. He says he's at peace with it all, knowing that he won just the one. That's enough for him. When Michael got out of his car after the race, Michael was very happy for Jean. Michael had the issue, that's true, but Alesi had battled his way into second to take advantage of the Michael's misfortune. And Michael wasn't thinking, you only won because I had problems. He was genuinely happy for Alesi that he'd finally won a Grand Prix. And as a fun fact, the 1995 Canadian Grand Prix is the only race that season that was not won by a Williams or a Benetton. This race happened 30 years ago today, and it's still talked about even now. So it makes you wonder what might happen this year. Could we see another fairy tale win? Leclerc, maybe Antonelli or something along those lines? But the stars could not have aligned any better when Alesi won in 1995, and you might struggle to find a more popular win for a Ferrari driver. Outside of winning at Monza anyway. I suppose there was Leclerc at Monaco, but I think this clears. So then, a look at the time Jean Alesi finally achieved his life dream of winning a Grand Prix, taking that win at Montreal in 1995, a race that happened 30 years ago on this day. If this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done, and for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help with the picture purchasing piggy bank, you can join the lovely people on screen by hitting the link down in the description, where there's also links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks for a one and done donation, and there's memberships too if you want to do Patreon but without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.